Hello, hello, it is Monday. Welcome to another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we're going to talk all about fatigue. What are the reasons that you fatigue in different races? Ultimately, we all slow down in races because of fatigue. Scientists love to study fatigue. There's been a lot of scientists over the years, all the way dating back to the 16 and 1700s, about what causes fatigue. And then most recently, in the 1900s, scientists have really have isolated the things that cause fatigue for different kinds of races. And so today's episode, we're going to go through all the different kinds of races and look at what are the specific things that cause fatigue, that cause you to slow down in races, and what can you do about it? How do you train to combat the fatigue? So if you're just joining us, welcome, boys and girls. Today is another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we talk all about fatigue in different races and how you can combat the fatigue. So let's start with the shortest of the distance races, and then we will get into the longer races. The longer the race, the more complicated, because there's more things that can happen during that time. So we'll get to all of that. So let's start talking about the shortest distance race. Sprinting is another animal, so we'll save that for another time. But for distance running races, 800 meters is the shortest distance race. That's the first race in which you see oxygen consumption being a limiting factor, and that it becomes more aerobic than anaerobic. So let's first talk about 800 meters. So for all of you out there who have a track and field background, or if you have kids who run track, 800 meters is a fantastic race. You need a great combination of speed and endurance. But the major thing that causes fatigue in 800 meters is the acidosis that develops. And so when you run really fast for a short period of time, there's lots of things that are going on. Your heart rate is pumping as much blood and oxygen as it can to the working muscles, but it becomes severely anaerobic, which means that you develop a lot of acidosis. And what does that really mean? Well, it all goes back to high school chemistry class. Remember when you took the little litmus paper out of a canister of paper and you dipped it in different acids and different bases, and the color of the paper changed color. And it changed color because of the amount of hydrogen ions in that solution that you dipped the paper into. And so when you drop the pH, when you run really fast, your muscles become more acidic. You drop the pH because of an increase in hydrogen ion production. And that is one major thing, and not the only thing, but that's one major thing that causes fatigue. And we call that metabolic acidosis. And those hydrogen ions get produced a lot because of the breakdown of ATP inside muscle. So when you run really fast, you are breaking down ATP rather quickly, and that's what helps liberate energy for muscle contraction. The breaking apart of those very strong phosphate bonds then liberates the energy that we need for muscles to contract, for the muscle proteins to interact with each other, and in such a way that we cause a shortening of the muscle. We can talk about muscle contraction in another episode. Actually, I think about episodes as I'm speaking, so that's a good idea for another episode. So we'll talk about muscle contraction on another episode. But the short of it is that when you race really short, like 800 meters, and even a mile or 1,500 meters, the major thing that causes fatigue is the metabolic acidosis. And so what can we do about that? Well, there are workouts that we can do to combat that fatigue so that we have then in the future run at a faster pace before we start to develop that acidosis. And that's why we could get faster for those races. That's how we get faster for those races. That you increase your buffering ability of those hydrogen ions. Our natural ability to buffer those hydrogen ions, to buffer the metabolic acidosis, is bicarbonate. We have a small store of bicarbonate ions, HCO3. If you remember back to high school chemistry class, HCO3 is bicarbonate. We have a small store of those bicarbonate ions inside of our muscles. And so when you run really fast for a short period of time, those bicarbonate ions buffer those hydrogen ions, HCO3 plus H. So it adds a hydrogen ion. And then we make carbonic acid from that, H2CO3. We take an H plus HCO3, you get H2CO3. And then that breaks apart into CO2 and water. And so we make our own CO2, we make our own water. It's pretty elegant. And then we have to exhale that CO2. That's why you breathe really heavy when you run short races or when you do short workouts. So how do we combat that fatigue? You combat that fatigue by causing that metabolic acidosis on a regular basis with interval workouts. So you run really short, really fast interval workouts so that on a repeated basis, you are lowering the pH so that we develop the mechanism to become a better buffer of that lowering of the pH of those hydrogen ions. And so that's why short, fast interval workouts that force your body to rely on the energy system that is responsible for these races, anaerobic glycolysis, which is the breaking down of glucose into pyruvate. That's what defines glycolysis. It's the breaking apart of glucose down into pyruvate. There's 9 chemical reactions that define anaerobic glycolysis. And I realize I'm being technical, but the reason I'm being technical is because guess what? Running's a technical sport. You have to have a very rich understanding of physiology and what's happening, and then you can isolate the causes of fatigue for these different races and then come up with workouts that are going to combat that fatigue and help you to run faster. So for 800 meters, even 1,500 meters a mile, the main thing that causes fatigue is the metabolic acidosis. And so you do workouts that cause acidosis. So for example, if you're training for 800 meters, maybe you do 300 meter reps at 800 meter race pace, and you do as many reps as it takes to cause fatigue. You take maybe a couple of minutes, depending on how fast you're running. Maybe you take a 1-to-2 work to rest ratio. So if you run, we'll make the math easy. If you run each 300 meter segment in 60 seconds, then you take 2 minutes recovery. Then you keep repeating that. You cause the acidosis during the workout so that you become a better buffer. Your muscles become a better buffer to that acidosis. And over time, over months, not just weeks, but over months to even years of training, you get faster because you're better able to tolerate and handle and buffer that acidosis so that a month from now or 3 months from now or a year from now, you can run at a faster pace before you start to develop the acidosis to the degree at which it causes fatigue and you to slow down. Incidentally, the way scientists define fatigue is a decrease in muscle force production. And so the reason why you slow down in races is simply because you can't produce as much force against the ground as you could when you're not fatigued. In the beginning of a race, when you're not fatigued, you can produce a lot of force against the ground. But as in this case, we're talking about the metabolic acidosis, once you develop the acidosis and the pH drops inside the muscle, you can't develop as much force, you can't produce as much force against the ground. And as I talked about on another episode, the more force you produce against the ground, the more the ground produces force against your foot. And that's called the ground reaction force. And the greater the ground reaction force, the greater the distance you're going to cover with every single step. So you're going to run faster, in other words. And so it's all about maximizing the ground reaction force. And when you get fatigued, you can't produce as much force against the ground, and so the ground reaction force decreases. Oh, Ben says, Karp is the smartest running coach around. Thank you very much. I try really hard. But, it's easy to fool people. There are a lot of people who know a lot more than me, but they're in academia. And so they don't go outside and coach runners. So I'm very grateful for the people I've learned from and the depth of knowledge I've acquired. So anyway, I can digress. But let's move on. So that's the 800 and 1,500 meters mile. And so there's a lot more going on, too. It's not just about the acidosis. It's also about blood flow. We'll talk about that as we get into the longer races, because blood flow and oxygen transport becomes extremely important. And that's also very important for the shorter races, because you can think of it as that the faster you can run before it starts to become very heavily anaerobic, the faster you're going to run. And so that gets back to the cardiovascular system and blood flow to the muscles. Most people, if they run at 7-minute mile pace, that's already fast for them. It's already slightly anaerobic for them. So if you can keep increasing the pace at which you can run, where you can deliver blood and oxygen to the muscles, then you can in effect delay anaerobic metabolism and all of the nasty side effects that come with that, the acidosis being the predominant one. There's other things that happen when you work anaerobically. There's other metabolites that accumulate, phosphate ions accumulate, and other metabolites that also are implicated in fatigue. But we're trying to make these things simple for the audience. So just know that acidosis is the big one, an increase in hydrogen ions from the breaking apart of ATP inside muscle. When we run fast, we get this very quick cycling of ATP. It's called ATP hydrolysis because it's a water-causing reaction. You need water in this chemical reaction. So that's why we call it ATP hydrolysis, is the breaking apart of ATP in the presence of water. that liberates the energy for muscle contraction. And so do workouts that cause acidosis. If you're training for the mile, then do 300-meter reps, 400-meter reps, 500-meter reps, 600-meter reps at mile or even slightly faster than mile race pace. Really cause the pH to drop repeatedly during the workout so that you develop the mechanism to be able to tolerate that acidosis. It's pretty fast running, not all out running, but it's pretty fast running that you repeat many times in a given workout. And then those cumulative workouts over time, it's not just any one workout, it's the cumulative effect of these workouts over time. If your body thinks that this dropping of the pH is a normal thing for you to experience, well, then over time you're going to develop the adaptations to be able to handle that normal experience. And so that's what training is all about, is subjecting your body to a given stress, a given threat, so that over time you develop the mechanisms to assuage that threat. It all goes back to Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. I've been writing about that now in my next book that's all on training theories, and a lot of this goes back to how the body adapts to stress. And so you have to subject your body to a given load, a given stress, in order for you to develop the adaptations to assuage the threat. And so that's the shorter races, 800 meters, 1,500 meters, a mile, is to focus on the metabolic acidosis. Now let's move up the ladder to the next fastest, the next distance races. Now we get into like 2 miles. High school runners run 3,200 meters or 2 miles, or 3K and 5K, and you can even put 10K into this as well, is that those races are predominantly influenced by blood flow to the muscle. I mean, you also have acidosis when you run 3K or 2 miles or 5K and even 10K for good runners. All those races are run above the lactate threshold. Here's your threshold. They're run above the threshold. So anytime you run above the threshold, there is an anaerobic contribution. So you still have the acidosis issue. You got to address that. So you do those short, fast workouts that develop acidosis. But then we also need to train our cardiovascular system to direct more blood and oxygen to the working muscles. The major limiting factor of those races of 3K, 5K, even 10K is lack of blood flow, lack of oxygen flow to the muscle. We have an inadequate supply, that's the better way to say it. It's an inadequate supply of oxygen to the working muscle based on the demand. It's all about supply and demand. If we have X demand, we have to have X supply. If we don't have X supply, then we're going to start to rely more on anaerobic metabolism for those races, and then we're going to fatigue because of the things we just talked about, the acidosis. So we need to focus on getting as much blood flow to the muscle as possible, and that's a cardiovascular responsibility. Don't worry about breathing hard. We talked on another episode all about breathing. It's not about taking deeper breaths. We have plenty of oxygen coming into us from the outside environment, except for when you're at altitude. Then we talked about altitude in another show as well. So we're covering everything on this Run Talk. Every episode we talk about another subject. It's great. And so for those races, for 3K to 10K in that range, it's really all about the cardiovascular system's ability to get blood flow and oxygen. How do you do that? Well, there's a myriad of things you can do. You increase the overall volume of work that you do through the easy runs, but the most potent way to do that is through interval training, VO2 max interval training, where you run at your heart's maximum capability to pump blood and oxygen. And so an example of an interval workout would be like 3 minutes at maximum heart rate, taking a 2 to 3 minute active jog recovery. And the reason for that is because of what happened. People get confused with the interval workouts. They think it's all about the work. It's really all about the recovery when you're talking about the VO2 max interval workouts. It's really about what happens in the recovery periods in between reps. And that's why I always refer to as reps and recovery intervals, because the interval really refers to the time period in between the reps. It doesn't refer to the reps. It refers to the interval of time between reps. And the reason why it's called an interval workout is fascinating. Because when you run at your maximum heart rate, say you run for 3 minute reps. So you run for 3 minutes, that gets your heart rate up to its maximum. And then when you recover and you jog in between, you have drastically reduced the intensity of the work. And when you do that, the demand for oxygen by the muscles has now decreased. But you have an enormous, what's called venous return, the return of blood back to the heart through the venous circulation. And so you have this slowing heart rate, but you have this enormous amount of blood being dumped into the atria and eventually the ventricles because you have this increased venous return. And that's why it's important to jog during the recovery interval. Because of the muscle pumping action, you increase the venous return. If you were just to stand still, you get all this pooling of blood in the muscles. The heart can't pump what it doesn't have. You have to get blood back up to the heart. So if you do light jogging, then you have this massaging effect, this pumping effect of the muscles to squeeze blood back up against gravity up to the heart. And so you have this increased venous return. You have more blood being dumped inside the heart, into the atria and then the ventricles of the heart, but you have a slowing heart rate. So what does that allow time for? It allows more time for more blood to enter into the heart. And if you remember back, if you've ever taken a cardiovascular physiology class, you learned about, or if you've ever had your blood pressure taken, you learned about systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction phase of the heart. Diastole is what happens in between beats. It's the resting phase of the heart. When you get your blood pressure taken, it's systolic blood pressure over diastolic blood pressure. And that's why the diastolic blood pressure is always lower, because it's during the rest phase of the heart. Basically, the heart is it's always in an interval workout. You have a period of work, period of rest, period of work, period of rest, period of work, period of rest. So the heart is in a forever interval workout up until the day you die. And so you have a slowing heart rate, but all this blood being dumped in, and so you have a greater what's called end diastolic volume, the volume of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole, at the end of the rest period. And when you have a greater end diastolic volume, guess what can happen when the next contraction? You get an increased stroke volume, an increased volume of blood being pumped out of the left ventricle per beat. And so because of an interval workout, you have many of these periods, many of these recovery intervals, you can get an increased stroke volume. And so that's why we call it an interval workout, and that's why you jog in between the reps. And so this is how we enhance, I know this is a long-winded answer, but this is how we enhance the cardiovascular system's ability to deliver more blood and oxygen to the working muscles by focusing on increasing its stroke volume. And if you take stroke volume multiplied by heart rate, you get cardiac output. And cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped by the heart per minute. So by doing these VO2 max interval workouts and focusing on what's happening during the recovery interval and making sure we jog during the recovery intervals to enhance venous return back to the heart, we get an enhanced stroke volume and enhanced cardiac output. And again, over time, over doing a series of these workouts over weeks to months and even years, then we improve our cardiovascular system's ability to deliver oxygen to the working muscles. How elegant is that? It's pretty elegant. Let me get to a question here. You explain the information well. Oh, that's not a question, but thank you. I'll take the compliment. Thank you, Tristy. You explain the information well. I try. I always try to. I'm not that smart, so I have to say it in a way that I can understand. And if I say it in a way that I can understand, then I know everybody else can understand it. So that's the mechanism of an interval workout for a VO2 max. So getting back to what causes fatigue in these races, it's an inadequate blood flow to meet the demand of the muscle, inadequate oxygen to meet the demand of the muscles. And so the way you increase that demand is by doing these VO2 max, by increasing the supply to meet the demand, is by doing these VO2 max interval workouts, where you focus on what's happening during the recovery interval, because that's when we get the peak in stroke volume. Okay, so because of the venous return, that's why I always jog in between. So a classic example, there's many ways you can set up the workout, but an example would be 3-minute reps, trying to reach your maximum heart rate during each rep, jog during the recovery interval for 2 to 3 minutes, where you get an increase in this stroke volume during the recovery interval. And then you repeat the rep as many times as it takes to become exhausted. And again, that's threatening to the heart's survival. It's about imposing a threat on some aspect of your body's survival. This kind of threat focuses on the heart's survival. You're working at the maximum capability for the heart to do its job. And by doing that, over time, the heart will become a better pump. And how does it do that? Through a couple of different ways. One, increase heart contractility. The contractility of the heart is the ability for the heart to contract forcefully and quickly. Just like if you want to train your biceps to become stronger and to produce more force, then you lift a very heavy weight that your biceps are not used to lifting. It's the same concept for the heart. The heart contracts almost exactly the same way as your biceps contract. There's a little bit of difference because the atria have to talk to the ventricles and vice versa. So there's these things in the heart called intercalated discs, That's another little bit of piece of trivia for you, so that the communication can happen between different parts of the heart. But in terms of how the heart shortens, how the muscle fibers shorten, it's the exact same mechanism as what we have in our biceps, and our quadriceps, and our hamstrings, and our gastrocnemius. It's all the same. And so the way for the heart to become a better pump is by increasing its ability to contract forcefully and quickly. That's called heart contractility. The other way, the most elegant way, I think, is that the heart will actually grow larger. Just like your biceps will grow larger if you lift heavy weights, your heart, specifically the left ventricle of your heart, which is responsible for pumping blood everywhere in the body except the lungs, the left ventricle will get larger. And if you have a larger container, it can hold more blood. And if it can hold more blood, it can subsequently pump more blood with each beat. And so those are the mechanisms by which we improve the ability for the cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen to the working muscles. We increase the force-generating ability of the heart by increasing its contractility. We increase the stroke volume and cardiac output so that we squeeze more blood with every single contraction. We squeeze more blood in every single minute. That's the cardiac output. Every minute, we squeeze a greater volume of blood every minute and every beat. And we enlarge the size of the heart to be able to do that, to hold more blood and pump more blood. So that's the middle distance rate. That takes us to the 3K to 10K or 3K to 5K in that range. The major reason, we also have the acidosis, so don't forget about that. But the major reason you fatigue is because of inadequate supply of oxygen to the working muscle, and that's why you can't sustain the pace. And when you can't do that anymore, when you can't deliver as much oxygen, then we start to rely more on anaerobic metabolism, and then the acidosis becomes a major player. And then we have to do workouts to combat that. Now let's get to the longer races, half marathon and marathon. Now it gets even more complicated because, the longer the race, the more time there is for things to go wrong. And so there's a lot of things that cause fatigue in the half marathon and especially the marathon. One still is the delivery of oxygen. That's the major one, the delivery of oxygen to the working muscle. So you have to do a lot of cardiovascular training to make your cardiovascular system better at delivering oxygen to the muscles. The other issue with the half marathon, especially the marathon, is that we run out of fuel. The marathon, that's the thing that makes the marathon unique from all other races, is that you run out of fuel, because we only have enough stored carbohydrate to last us a little bit more than 2 hours of sustained moderate intensity exercise. And so you become, everyone's heard the term glycogen depletion. You get depleted. It's not so much in the half marathon, and maybe for slower runners who take 2 hours or so, then that'll happen in the half marathon for them. But certainly everybody in the marathon, except the very elite runners who run just over 2 hours, they're not going to get glycogen depleted in a marathon. That's why you never see them take carbohydrate stuff in a race, because it's only taken them 2 hours to run it. But for everybody else, the marathon is long enough that you're going to run out of carbohydrate. And so you need to do workouts to try to increase how much carbohydrate you store. Again, it's all about imposing some kind of threat on some aspect of your body's survival. And so if you regularly do very, very long runs that deplete your tank, deplete the carbohydrate fuel tank, then your body responds by making a bigger fuel tank and synthesizing and storing more glycogen for the future. So that next time, or next week, or next month, you'll have to run longer to deplete the fuel tank. Imagine if your car did that. Imagine if you're driving down the highway until your gas tank is empty, and then when your car is sitting on your driveway during recovery, the gas tank gets larger, so that next time you have to drive more miles for the gas tank to be emptied. It's the same concept. That's what your body does. Wouldn't it be great if your car did that? Gas companies wouldn't like that, because then you wouldn't have to buy fuel as often. But that's what your body does. And so on a regular basis, you got to run very, very long to deplete the fuel tank, and not take carbohydrate while you're running long, because that defeats the purpose. So go on very long runs, deplete the tank, so that in recovery your body responds to that threat by making a larger fuel tank and storing and synthesizing more glycogen so that you have more fuel and improves your endurance. Another thing that causes fatigue in these long races is muscle fiber damage. From that constant hitting of the pavement for so many miles or for such a long amount of time, there's a lot of damage to the muscle fibers. Because remember, every time you land on the ground, you produce force on the ground. The ground produces force up against your foot. and it's absorbed by the muscles and the tendons and all the other structures that we have. And so that constant ground reaction, that repeated ground reaction force over a long period of time, it causes a lot of muscle damage, especially if there's downhill in the course that you're running. I just had one of my athletes ran a race in South Dakota last week. It was a lot of downhill. And so her muscles got pretty sore after the race is over, because when you do a lot of downhill running, you get a lot of soreness. But even if it's a flat course, when you run a marathon, you're out there for a few hours, there's a lot of muscle damage, especially if the course is going up and down and up and down. There's a lot of muscle fiber damage. And so how do you combat that? Well, use some common sense. You go and you run long. Again, you go and you duplicate, you simulate what it's going to be like in the race. You go do very long runs, and you incorporate some downhill. Even if the course that you're training for is going to be flat, the downhill training can actually help, because there's a prophylactic effect to running downhill and the muscle fiber damage. Once your body senses that threat, then it makes adaptations and the muscle fibers grow back stronger than they were before. So eccentric training with some slight downhills, even to train for a flat marathon, is a good idea, because it helps with protecting your muscles from future damage. And so you got to run very long on a regular basis to assuage that threat, to make the adaptations to assuage that threat, so that when you get into the marathon itself, your muscles have already recognized that stimulus, have recognized that threat, and you won't experience as much muscle damage as you would have if the marathon represents a new stress. The whole goal of running a half marathon and marathon is you got to try as much as possible to simulate it in training, so that the day of the race, it's not a new thing that your body is experiencing. You've already been there, done that. You've already experienced that stress in training. And so the more often that you can subject yourself to those long runs, to those glycogen depleting runs, to those muscle fiber damaging runs, then the better off you're going to be in the race. Because what happens, again, getting back to what causes fatigue in these races, what happens when you have muscle fiber damage? Well, then you can't produce as much force against the ground anymore, and the pace will slow down. And that's why muscle fiber damage hurts your performance, because it's all about maximizing muscle force production. And if there's muscle fiber damage, then those muscle fibers aren't going to contract as effectively, and everything slows down. And that's why you slow down in a marathon, and even in a half marathon to some degree. Another thing that causes fatigue in these long races is dehydration. People don't realize how important hydration is to maintain performance, to maintain the pace in these long races. When you lose body water because you're sweating for so long, you're losing water. Where does that water come from? It comes from the blood. You have different components of the blood. Water is a big component of the plasma volume of the blood. So you get plasma volume constriction, so the total blood volume decreases because you're dropping plasma volume because of the loss of water. And then out of the cells, the interstitial fluid decreases, you're losing water from that. And remember back what I said maybe half an hour ago about ATP. To break apart ATP into its constituents to liberate energy for muscle contraction, you need water. And so if you're dehydrated, there are a few different consequences of that. One is the decreased ATP hydrolysis, because you're lacking water because you're dehydrated. And so ATP hydrolysis decreases, then muscle force production decreases. And then the issue is to blood volume and what that does to the cardiovascular system. So this gets back to the lack of blood flow to the muscle. Again, the goal is to get as much blood and much oxygen to the muscle as possible. If you get dehydrated and blood volume decreases, if blood volume decreases, guess what happens to stroke volume? It decreases. If stroke volume decreases, cardiac output decreases. And in response to the decreased stroke volume, the heart rate has to compensate to try to maintain the cardiac output. Your body's going to try to do what it can to maintain the cardiac output to match the supply to the demand. So if stroke, remember cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. If stroke volume decreases, we have to compensate for that with the heart rate, to increase heart rate to try to maintain the cardiac output. So that's why you see heart rate called cardiac drift. The heart rate will drift upwards in these long races to try to maintain the cardiac output. And so getting back to the blood flow issue, so if stroke volume decreases, cardiac output will eventually decrease because the heart rate can only get so high to try to compensate. So the stroke volume and cardiac output decrease. If cardiac output decreases, then blood flow to the muscle decreases. If blood flow to the muscle decreases, then we decrease the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to the muscle. And so that's why dehydration is so important, because it affects ATP hydrolysis inside the muscle to produce muscle force, and it affects the cardiovascular system and blood flow to the muscle. And oxygen, ultimately it's about oxygen flow to the muscle. And so that's why, so look at all these things already that we have for these longer races. We didn't even talk about the psychological fatigue. That's another issue with long races, that when during prolonged exercise, you have changes in neurotransmitters. You have changes in serotonin and dopamine in the brain, and so that affects motivation. You run so long, eventually you want to stop because you get tired. So there's the whole psychological issue also occurs in long races, especially the marathon, and really in ultra marathons. If you get into those really long races, then you have the changes in neurotransmitters in the brain that affect, that cause psychological fatigue. And so again, how do you combat that? You run long very repeatedly. You run long all the time to get used to to try to combat the psychological fatigue. It's all about hardening yourself, toughening yourself to the effort over a long period of time. And so if you always go on 2-hour runs, 3-hour runs, and it becomes a regular stimulus for you, eventually a 3-hour run doesn't feel like such a big deal because you've done it multiple times. And so that's how you combat the fatigue in these long races. You do long runs repeatedly to create a bigger fuel tank of the glycogen, to assuage the threat and make the muscle fibers more resilient so that they don't incur the muscle fiber damage, and also the psychological fatigue, and then getting back to the dehydration. So what do you do to combat that fatigue? Well, you drink. And that's why in the marathon or half marathon itself, it's important to drink a lot of fluids that will maintain hydration so that you don't fall off the pace, so that you can maintain blood volume as much as possible. You're always going to get dehydrated, and especially in a marathon. Everyone who crosses the finish line in a marathon is dehydrated because you can't get, while you're running, you can't get enough fluid in compared to what you're losing through sweating. You're going to sweat. The rate of water loss through sweating is greater than the rate at which you can consume water, especially when you're running. Try to consume water out of those little Dixie cups. Half of it goes up your nose, half of it gets poured all over your body, but you got to try to ingest as much of it as you can to delay dehydration so that you can maintain blood flow to the muscles and try to maintain the pace for as long as possible. So these long races, it gets a little bit more complicated. There's multiple factors that cause fatigue, but they're all trainable. They're all trainable through different strategies. The long runs, the hydrating yourself during the runs, and maybe doing some eccentric, incorporate eccentric downhill running into some of your longer runs to incur muscle fiber damage so that you heal them stronger, better when during recovery. So there's lots of things that you can do to try to combat the fatigue. Let's see. I know I'm talking a lot. Let's see if there's, any questions here. Should the intervals always be at max heart rate? As we progress over time, should the intervals be longer? Okay, good question. So it depends on the purpose of the workout. But yeah, for VO2 max intervals, then yes, you want to be knocking on the door of your max heart rate during each rep. So for other kinds of interval workouts, no. For the anaerobic interval workouts, it makes no difference what your heart rate. Leave the heart rate monitor at home because you're training something entirely different. You're not focused on the cardiovascular system. But for VO2 max interval workouts, when the purpose is to focus on the heart's ability to pump blood and oxygen, then yes, you want to be reaching or getting very close to reaching your max heart rate during the reps. And over time, one strategy, you're correct, one strategy, again, it depends on your strengths and weaknesses as a runner, because you always want to skew the train to your strengths. It depends on the length of the distance of the race that you're training for. But one strategy is to increase the duration of the reps. I wouldn't go any more than 5-minute reps for a VO2 max workout, and 5-minute reps is even difficult unless you're very talented, because it's you're working at your heart's maximum capability to pump blood and oxygen. 5 minutes is already very long. VO2 max pace, you can think of it as the fastest pace that you can maintain for 7 to 10 minutes. So a 5-minute rep is very long when you consider that's the fastest pace you can maintain for 7 to 10 minutes. So if you do 5-minute reps, you may only be able to do 2 of them, and then you're done. Then you're so tired. So I would stick to the shorter end, maybe 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and do as many reps as possible. But then, you can extend it by 20 seconds, 30 seconds, or if you do it on a track, 100 meters, 200 meters at a time, you can extend the duration. The other way you can make the workouts harder and progress over time is to reduce the recovery interval. So instead of, if you're doing 3-minute reps, instead of taking 3-minute recovery, take 2:30 recovery. Or instead of 2.5 recovery, take 2 minutes recovery. So you can reduce the time of the recovery interval. That's also one way to make the workouts harder and progress over time. Another way is to do more reps. So say you do 4 times 3 minutes as your first workout, then maybe next week you do 5 times 3 minutes. And then maybe 3 weeks from now you do 6 times 3 minutes. And so you can manipulate an interval workout doing multiple things, but the hardest way to do it would be to increase the duration of each rep. So instead of 800-meter reps, you go 1,000-meter reps, or instead of 1,000-meter reps, you do 1,200-meter reps. That's what's going to make it harder. That's the hardest strategy. But it's very effective that way to try to increase the duration at which you hold that maximum heart rate. So, very good question. I'm glad you asked that question. Christopher, could you please discuss benefit or otherwise of running long weekly training run in the morning without breakfast? Okay, so that gets back into the glycogen depletion. So as a way to combat that cause of fatigue for long races is to do the long runs without having had carbohydrates. So you start the run in you're not going to be fully glycogen depleted first thing in the morning. Maybe it's 12 hours or so since you ate dinner the night before or however long it was. But if you start out the run with a lowered glycogen fuel tank, then obviously it doesn't take as long to deplete the tank because you go right from not eating anything to running. And so yes, that's a good strategy to run first thing in the morning. Plus, most marathons are first thing in the morning anyway, so you got to get used to running long first thing in the morning. Although before the marathon, you want to go to the start line glycogen full, so don't do that strategy in the marathon. You want to have a breakfast, a small breakfast before the start of the marathon. It's a slightly different strategy for training, where you're trying to deplete the tank to get the physiological adaptations to combat that cause of fatigue in the marathon. You want to go to the start line of a marathon with as large of a glycogen fuel tank as possible. And so to train to make that happen, start the runs with before breakfast so that you're not going into the run glycogen full, because then it'll take longer to deplete the tank. So good question. So keep asking questions. These are great questions. I can keep scrolling. It's hard to scroll. I'll ask. Hello, Jana. She's in the room. I will try to post things. If I can't get to all the questions, then I'll post things in the comments. Again, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. I got two cameras going on here. Sometimes I'll look at Facebook camera, sometimes I'll look at Instagram camera, but then I can get dizzy doing that. So welcome. If you're just joining us, welcome to Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Today's episode is all about looking at the causes of fatigue for different races, and then how to train to combat the fatigue. So that's one approach. Not the only approach, but that's one approach that you can take to training for the different races, is ask yourself, what are the things that cause fatigue in these races? What's going to make my pace slow down? And then how do I train to combat that fatigue? So we just went through them all, 800 meters all the way up to the marathon. At the shorter races, the acidosis plays a more significant factor, and so you have to train to combat that acidosis. For the longer races, you have the glycogen depletion, the dehydration, the muscle fiber damage. And then for all the races in the middle, you have a combination of the acidosis as well as the cardiovascular system's ability to deliver blood and oxygen to the working muscles. And so that is a very simplified, you guys just got a gem, by the way. That's a very simplified way of attacking this, because it's extremely complicated, as you can imagine. When you race 800 meters or when you race a marathon, there's a million freaking things going on inside of your body. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, well, what is the precise reason why I'm getting slow, why I'm slowing down in this race? There's a lot of things that cause fatigue, and they all are intertwined. So I'm making this a lot more simple than it really is. This is extremely complex. The way your cardiovascular system orchestrates a response when other things happen, and so it tries to compensate to try to deliver more blood and oxygen. It's amazing, all the things that happen when you're running a race, and how all these things come together to create this beautiful performance. And your goal as a runner, as a coach, is to try to enhance all of these factors so that when you get to the starting line of a race, you are firing on all cylinders, and you have anaerobic metabolism worked out, and you have aerobic metabolism worked out, so that you can run the best race you possibly can. So, I'm really simplifying this for you because there's a lot that's going on here, but that's the beauty of it. I love dealing with the complexity of this, and that's one of the things I love most about coaching is the dealing with the complexity of human physiology and figuring out the right training program to maximize performance. It's a beautiful process. I've always enjoyed that ever since I was a kid. I've been in love with that process for many years. So let's see. What most effective nutrition after a 10K and when done fasted? So there's a couple of questions there. So after a 10K, the thing about these shorter races, you're not going to run out of carbohydrates. So post-race nutrition isn't that important for anything shorter than a marathon, and maybe a half marathon if it takes about 2 hours or more to complete. You just have a normal diet, which for a runner should be normally high in carbohydrate and have a lot of protein, especially when you do the harder workouts and there's muscle fiber damage. You need the protein to repair that damage and also to adapt. That's how we adapt. It's protein synthesis to make more mitochondria, to build more capillary networks. It's all build more enzymes. It's all protein synthesis. So you need a lot of protein in your diet. So a normal balanced diet that is high in carbohydrate, higher in protein, although fat will be a higher content than the protein content. But runners need more protein than people who don't run, or even people who don't do all kinds of athletes need higher protein, especially strength trained athletes. But for the marathon, it's very important to replace the carbohydrate as fast as possible because that's key to recovery. And also after long runs, when you go run very long, then your body needs to resynthesize the carbohydrate and store it. So how does it do that? Well, it needs the carbohydrate coming in. You got to stuff it through your mouth in order for it to get ultimately to get to the muscles, then be formed into glycogen to be stored. So after these long runs, you have to get in carbohydrate. If you don't consume carbohydrate, then the rate of glycogen synthesis, to use a scientific term, the rate of glycogen synthesis is going to be a lot slower. In fact, there's a lot of research that show that you can delay glycogen resynthesis in the muscle if you don't consume carbohydrate within a short window afterward, within an hour or so afterward. And so as soon as you get done with your long run, I just did this yesterday. I had chocolate milk in the car waiting for me. I ran in beautiful Mission Bay in San Diego yesterday. And as soon as I got done with my long run, in the car ride home, I'm drinking the chocolate milk. And so chocolate milk is a great post-workout recovery drink. It's my research that has shown that. We published that in 2006. We were the first ones to publish research on the effectiveness of chocolate milk. It's high in protein, high in carbohydrate. And so that's the best thing to have right after a long run where you severely lower the glycogen fuel tank is to consume carbohydrate and protein, preferably in a liquid first because it's quickly digestible, low fat to make it quickly digestible. And that's a great way to start the resynthesis of glycogen process. Regarding training for 1 mile, John Mendez says, regarding training for the 1 mile for someone over 50, what is a good way to get back speed and quickness? It's a good question. As you get older, I'm 47 myself, so you got to be careful with the intensity. Once I got into my 40s, I started having Achilles tendonitis when I started putting on those short fast because I'm a miler too. And so I love doing the short, fast speed work. But you just have to be careful. So the best way to do it is just start with one workout a week. Start with a basic workout. Maybe you do 200s at mile race pace with a 100-meter jog recovery. So that's not so metabolic yet. It's more neuromuscular. So start with the neuromuscular work first. Get your legs used to running at mile race pace. Then you can add in the more metabolic anaerobic training, which would be like 400s. There's a big difference, believe it or not, from doing 400s at mile race pace and 200s at mile race pace. That extra 200 meters matters a lot. And the reason is because when you go only, maybe 45 seconds, say you're doing 200 meter, let's make the math easy, 90 seconds per 400, or at 6-minute pace, 45 seconds per 200. In 45 seconds, there's not a lot of metabolic acidosis. So it becomes more neuromuscular, where it becomes you're not developing a lot of acidosis. But when you run 400s instead of 200s, now you're running 90 seconds instead of 45 seconds. There's a lot more acidosis in those extra 45 seconds. And so it feels a lot more difficult. And so I would start with 200s. If you haven't done these kinds of workouts in years, start with 100-meter repeats and just do a bunch of hundreds with a short recovery at a mile race pace, and then you can start lengthening it, then do 200s, then you could do 300s, then you could do 400s, and then it'll start to get more and more difficult. So start with the neuromuscular way of doing it, and the muscle fiber, when I say neuromuscular, I mean the muscle fiber recruitment, the skill of it. Get used to running at mile race pace for a short amount of time where you avoid the heavy metabolic acidosis, so it's not so demanding. And then over time, as you develop that skill and you ingrain the muscle fiber recruitment and get your legs used to that pace, then you can extend the duration that you hold that pace. So then do the 300s and the 400s, the 500s, where you dip much more into anaerobic glycolysis as an energy system, and it becomes much more fatiguing very quickly. Then you develop a lot of acidosis very quickly, because there's a big difference when you're running 90 seconds at that pace versus 45 seconds, or whatever pace you're running. 40 seconds versus 80 seconds, it's a big difference. Or if you're quite speedy and you're running 30, back when I was in my 20s and 30s and I was running, a 440 pace for these kinds of workouts, doing 200s at that pace doesn't feel so difficult because there's not a lot of acidosis being developed. But 400s much more difficult. And so that's a way to do it. I would start with just one workout a week and start with the neuromuscular aspect of it by doing very short reps where you just get the legs used to running at mile race pace. So good. I hope that answers your question, John. And then you can do other kinds of workouts too, the plyometrics, anything that helps produce more power, force over time, to produce more force in less time, that's power. And so those kinds of workouts will help too. You're welcome, John. I always love talking to milers. I've always had a fascination with the mile and the 800 because it is such a beautiful, complex interaction between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. People think the marathon is complicated. Training for 800 meters is much more complicated because you have to develop yourself just as much anaerobically as aerobically, whereas the marathon is all aerobic. The anaerobic contribution to a marathon is negligible. So from a training standpoint, it's a lot more simple to write a training plan. It's much more complex to write a training plan to train for the 800 meters or the mile. But that's the beauty of it. I love the complexity of it. It's a beautiful process. Okay, any other questions? I don't get to all the questions, I notice sometimes. So whatever questions, I'll write responses. So that covers everything we want to talk about today. So if there are no other questions, then I'll get into my final thought of the day. So my final thought today is patience. During this whole pandemic, we are being forced to do something that is not natural for human beings. We are forced to be patient. We always want to know the outcome of something. We want to know how long the pandemic will. If you tell us that come December 31st, this will all be over, starting January 1st, we can all go back to our lives, we would all be able to deal with that, right? It's the unknown. And so we don't know when things are going to end. And guess what? This is extremely true for distance running performance. I always relate it back to running performance. To be a better runner, you have to be patient because things don't happen quickly. It takes time, especially aerobically. It takes time to develop yourself into a good distance runner. You have to train for many weeks, many months, even many years to meet your genetic potential for distance running performance. It's not something that's going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next month. It's not even going to happen 6 months from now. It takes a long time to really develop yourself. And one of the reasons is because of what I talked about before, the protein synthesis. It takes time to make more mitochondria. It takes time to build more enzymes. It takes time to really develop yourself in the way that you need to really fulfill your potential as a runner. And so you have to be patient. You have to do the work. You have to be patient. You don't know how long it's going to take to meet your potential because it's in some cases it's not predictable. Some people adapt really quickly. Other people take a longer time to adapt. It's not always predictable. And that's one of the flaws. I talk about this in the new book that will come out sometime next year. It's all about training theories and periodization. And that's one of the flaws of periodization. It's one of the assumptions is that we can predict how long it's going to take to adapt. We can predict that if we do this work now, it's going to cause us this adaptation 6 months from now, and then we can plan the training in the future based on adaptation now. And that's a poor assumption. You can't predict in all cases, even in most cases. You don't know what's going to happen. And so you got to be patient. You got to plan the training in such a way that you factor in. Patience should be a factor of every training program. You should factor in patience, because it takes time to develop yourself the right way, in the right order of the training that you do. It takes time to develop yourself. And so my final thought for today's episode of Run Talk is to be patient, to recognize that every day that you go outside the door to run, you are laying one more brick, and one more brick, and tomorrow one more brick, and the next day one more brick, and one more brick, and one more brick, and one more brick, and one more brick. And after 6 months or a year or 10 years of doing this, of laying down bricks, you have laid down the entire structure of becoming a better distance runner and becoming a better person throughout the process. So that's my final thought that I leave you with. Thank you for joining another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. See you next week.